Hey, Engineering Tomorrow fans, I'm your host, Brian Gomsky. Today we are interviewing Pradyut Paul, CEO and co-founder of Bild. Bild is a modern design management platform that brings together cloud storage, product data management, project management, and design reviews together for the first time. Stick around and see how Bild is changing the way MEP design is done and managed in the future to come. Sit back, relax, and get ready for Engineering Tomorrow.
Broadcasting around the world. This is Engineering Tomorrow, the podcast committed to bringing you the best in commercial construction, design, and engineering from the brightest minds in the industry. This is the stuff they don't teach you in school. So sit back, relax, and open your mind. You're about to get the insider knowledge to improve your next construction project or advance your career. This is Engineering Tomorrow.
Hey, Pradyut, how are you doing today?
Doing really well. How are you, Brian?
Excellent, excellent. Where are we speaking to you from?
I am out in San Francisco, California.
Awesome. Yep, we're out here in St. Louis. And you mentioned you've spent a little time out here in Chicago, so...
That's right. Grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, spent almost 2 decades out there, went down to school at Urbana-Champaign, so very familiar with that region of the Midwest.
Cool. So, Pradyut, tell me a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. So a lot of my background is revolving around electrical engineering. I come from a very technical background from both my academic studies as well as my profession in EE. So started out as a low-level RFIC designer out at Raytheon, really creating next generation chips for space and airborne systems. Quickly moved over to a higher level system level design over at a startup out in Santa Barbara. We were creating these Bluetooth electronic devices, very similar to the AirTags that you see nowadays that Apple created. So led the team of hardware engineers out there, and that was really the first time I got involved in roles outside of just electrical engineering. So got a lot of opportunity to spend leading the overall hardware team from mechanical to electrical to firmware, all the way to manufacturing and test and validation. So really the entire gambit of the low-level nature of hardware engineering all the way to the high-level system architecture at a startup.
Okay. So you really got a good picture of a mile-high view of how everything works as well.
Yeah, that's like one of the benefits of working at a startup is, you really get the responsibility and accountability of essentially managing an entire product line. So we were selling over a couple million units every year. Going from a couple thousand a day all the way to multiple thousand a day and ramping up that manufacturing facility in China.
Oh, wow. What do you think's happening in the hardware market around development tools right now?
Yeah, so really, I think over the last 2 years, these companies have revisited essentially what is the core infrastructure of how they develop their designs. So back in the day, a lot of the developer tools revolved around these archaic processes, the Microsoft Suite, email, these screenshots that were floating around. If you actually look at the infrastructure of how designs were made and shared, it would all be network server based. So you'd have to physically go into your workstation at the office, get connected to a hardwired network server, and start designing, whether it was in SolidWorks, Altium, Cadence, whatever it was there. Nowadays, what we're seeing is hardware companies are looking to understand how can you have a more hybrid/remote work culture. And obviously having that base foundation of this network server-based collaboration is just not going to work, right? So developer tools are now moving from what used to be supplementary to in-person communication to now something that's more like what we're doing right now over Zoom or cloud collaboration, as we call it. And so we're finally seeing the shift from on-prem systems in the developer community to cloud-based systems. So whether that's a company in the hardware industry integrating Slack or implementing Microsoft Teams as for part of their main communication, or just moving away from in-person meetings and CAD spins, right? So the next generation of developer tools for these hardware companies are really going to be cloud native. They're going to be purpose built for the designers that don't have to be in person every single day and that really allow for a more distributed team.
Okay. Traditionally, hardware companies, and there are probably still a lot of hardware companies like this, have been very hesitant on adopting cloud tools. What do you see is changing in that mindset?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of companies that have essentially said we're never going to move off of our on-prem solutions, and they've been like that for decades. All of a sudden, there's been this shift in the market where hardware has finally caught up to, let's say, the software industry. They've seen how cloud-based solutions can really expedite a lot of their manufacturing processes, a lot of their design processes, and really is the foundation of this new culture that we live in, right? In the past, you had to go in office, and that was the only real thing that people cared about, right? Is what are the tools that can support us being in the workstation? Today, what we're seeing are companies finally saying, okay, we know that this can't be the case. What are the solutions there for us? And VPN, right, is just not as great as what it used to be. They want to have a cloud native tool. It's a true and tried a solution in other industries. They've seen the benefits and they're finally open to actually trying this out. So we've noticed these manufacturing companies out in the Midwest, out in the South that have been on on-prem solutions for decades, finally saying, okay, we're going to move to Google Drive or we're going to move to Dropbox as now our main form of cloud storage. And they'll start with that as a lightweight way of getting to the cloud, but quickly realize that these solutions weren't really built for the hardware industry, right? They're not built for CAD development or board development. And they'll start looking out for more now cloud solutions that is purpose built for hardware.
Could you elaborate on that more specifically? I guess why specifically did it not work previously for hardware?
Yeah, so hardware as an industry has been very conservative in nature. There's a lot of IP around these CAD models, and so the leaders in the hardware industry decades ago basically said, well, if these CAD models get out, we essentially lose all IP. Okay. And you folks in other countries that are essentially getting hold of this IP and replicating products.
Sure.
And so the idea was that if we can keep it on-prem, it's more secure. We won't have these data leaks. And that's just kind of been this conservative nature in hardware. But as technologies evolved and security has gotten better and encryption, and there's now all these other security layers and protocols around what cloud storage looks like, the hardware industry has finally said, okay, there is an opportunity for us to host IP out in the cloud without having to worry about these factors that we had thought about before.
Gotcha. What do you think is the biggest challenge that design engineers face today?
Yeah, this is a great question. We work with design engineers every day, whether mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, or even industrial engineers. And we hear the same thing, is they're spending too much time just not designing. They're spending at least 30% of their week just going back and forth with cross-functional stakeholders, whether it's sales or marketing, whether it's management of another department, communicating some of their design changes, or talking through feedback that these other teams have with them. And right now, the developer tools are placed in such a way that it doesn't allow an easy way for these other teams to communicate with them. So they're spending a lot of time organizing feedback over email, sifting through thousands of screenshots, right? I mean, when we think of CAD, it's very visual in nature.
Yeah.
Not as easy as saying, go look at line 35 in this code, right? And you can't just say, I'm going to give you an XYZ coordinate and go find this bolt there. It's literally screenshots that are being sent over email. So they're spending a lot of time just managing this communication and feedback from these cross-functional stakeholders. So that's about a third of their time. The other third of their time is just sitting in meetings. And they're really frustrated. They don't want to be sitting on Zoom calls rotating CAD models, or they don't want to be sitting on Zoom calls just in case someone has a question on the design that only they can answer. They want to have this more asynchronous environment where they can control their own schedule, where they can improve their bandwidth to actually do their core competency. when we look at an organization, oftentimes these designers are like the highest paid individuals, yet the bandwidth and the utilization of their core skills is not being, at 100%. And so really what these engineers want to do is find a process that's meaningful for them and tailored for them so that they can still have these engagements with these cross-functional stakeholders that enable the company to progress in the right way, but also allow them to have more time to focus on what they want to do, which is design and innovate.
Mm-hmm. What is the landscape of tools that design engineers are using right now, and how would you say that's adapted over time?
I love, really kind of looking back at how things have evolved. If you look at like the 1980s, 1990s,
Mm-hmm.
the number one way that you would actually talk about these, again, very visual designs is you'd print it out on this very large piece of paper.
Oh, yeah.
You get this marker and you'd circle different parts and you'd annotate it. We'd redline these documents essentially, right? And if you wanted to send to somebody else, you'd roll it up and send to them, or you'd scan it. Fast forward to the early 2000s. They're pretty much doing the same thing, except now instead of like scanning it or handing it over, you're pretty much just taking a picture of it and emailing it over.
Mm-hmm.
So not much had really changed over those 2 decades. 2010 came and there was some innovation in the CAD environment, and you could now take screenshots. You can now convert 3D CAD to 2D flats, right? There were these drawings or PDFs. Companies like Bluebeam came out that allowed you to take CAD and make it in the 2D PDF format. And there were PDF viewers that allowed you to mark it up. So now instead of having to print out CAD, you could convert it to this 2D model, and then you could redline it on your computer, right? But that's kind of not how it's stuck, right? We're creating a 3D model, but we're living in a 2D world, which seems counterintuitive because a lot of that, the fidelity of that product, of that model is lost when you convert it. And so what we're seeing in the market is even though these software tools are there, you still have that requirement of pulling up that 3D model, walking through it, taking cross sections, being able to take measurements, right? We don't want to take really, really rich data and convert it to dumb CAD. We want to keep it as smart CAD and leverage as much of that data as possible. And so over the last decade, none of those processes have changed. We're still living in that 2D world where companies are still using these 2D flats, whether it's in the form of a screenshot or a PDF. They're sharing these documents over email as attachments or adding them as slide decks. And so issue tracking and communication still is living in the 2D world, even though the designers are building 3D CAD models. And so the idea and where we're trying to go to over the next few years is if you're building in a 3D model, you want to convey all of your designs in a 3D fashion. And so how can you do that in a meaningful way where it's cloud-based, right? In the past, the technology really hasn't allowed for these really rich designs to live in the cloud, to be able to render, to be able to have meaningful engagements. We're finally there where technology has caught up and has allowed this level of collaboration to finally exist. And so at Bild, that's a lot of what we're focusing on is how can we take a 3D environment and convey it in 3D rather than having to convert it in 2D and then have a level of communication and collaboration there.
Okay, I'm with you so far. When we think of the future, what would you then say is the ideal solution for design engineers?
Yeah, so there's, the way we look at it is there's a lot to learn from these other industries. So for example, if we look at like the software industry, right, you would never look at the software engineers like taking a screenshot of code and then sending it over. They would literally copy this code. And that's because code is, text is universal. You can load it in any computer. That's kind of our goal, right? Is how can you share a model without having to, down convert it or having to make it dumb and share it with another collaborator. And so we use a lot of inspiration from the software industry and seeing what works and what doesn't work. But it's not just as easy as replicating the workflow from the software industry over to the hardware industry. You have to understand the nuances of the engineers, right? We're living in a world where you can't just design something, deploy it, and then change it after it's been deployed like it is in software. When you manufacture something, it's done. And there's a very high cost to change that product. And so we understand these nuances in the workflows. And where the future is, it's replicating what's done in other industries that are about 5 to 7 years ahead of us and putting in the flavor of the hardware industries, understanding the nuances, understanding the kind of assets that we live in, text-based assets in the software industry versus very visual assets in the hardware industry. Even if you look at marketing assets and these other digital assets, they're very visual in nature. And so how can you replicate the technologies and the workflows that have been able to provide a lot of value in these other industries now in the hardware industries. And so that's kind of where we're headed. Being, again, very cloud first is extremely important for the new world that we live in today, where we're not just relying on sitting behind an engineer's desk and having them walk through our design, but having meaningful engagements from across the world.
Okay. So obviously you are with Bild. So tell me, what is Bild, and everything we've talked about, how does Bild fit into all of this?
Yeah. So at Bild, we're a design management platform. And so what does that mean? We own different parts of the workflow for these design engineers, all the way from a PDM tool that allows you to do version control on your designs, to having a single source of truth, to check and check out capabilities, to cloud storage. How do you have a better feel of Google Drive, right? So when you put assets on Google Drive, like a CAD model, Google Drive doesn't render it. And so a lot of the value Google Drive provides to the people using Google Drive is to be able to quickly look at designs or quickly look at PDFs. And so we want to replicate a better version of cloud storage specifically built for the hardware engineers. Then we go into the project management layer. So we've talked about these software platforms that have been innovative over the past few years. Tools like Jira, tools like Asana, Monday.com, that have a lot of value for software engineers because they've been built around these text-based assets. How can we replicate the feel, but put in the flavor for hardware engineers that allow the same feeling, the Kanban boards, the issue tracking, the task management, all of that to be built around these three-dimensional assets? And then we go into design reviews. So we've talked a little bit about how design reviews over the past few decades have essentially been all in person, sitting across the table from each other, having a designer rotate a model. How can we allow for a future where designers can do their own thing and anyone that wants to review a design can just come in and asynchronously review a design, provide their feedback without being reliant on a designer? And so we take those four pillars, PDM, cloud storage, project management, design reviews, and combine it into what we call a design management platform, really enabling the future of hardware engineering to be less reliant on in-person engagements, more allowing for collaboration across different teams to come into the process at their own speed and allow for a tailored experience around hardware engineering.
And this frees up like you said earlier, your design engineers to do what they want to do, which is design.
Exactly. That's right.
So what is the plan for the future of Bild?
Right. So everything we've talked about right now has been really rotating around CAD and these design engineers sitting in front of a computer. But the reality is that as a mechanical or electrical engineer, there's another dimension to their work, right? They don't just stop at a CAD station. They have to go and manufacture these designs. There's testing and validation, and then there's iterating on top of these models. And so the future of Bild is encompassing the entire workflow for this specific engineer, right? For the specific designer. So we're providing a lot of value in terms of what collaboration and communication and the workflows around building CAD look like. But once you go and actually manufacture the product on the factory floor, you're collecting a lot of rich data that unfortunately is very difficult to access. And so the future of Bild is taking all of this rich data that's coming in these downstream engagements that include manufacturing, testing, validation, quality control, and rolling it up into a platform so you get a holistic view of not only your designs, but empirical data that you're collecting on those designs to make more informed decisions faster on in the development cycle.
Okay. It sounds like a great tool. we have a lot of mechanical engineers who listen to this, as well as mechanical engineering students. So for the companies that are listening and they want to streamline their processes and get engineers doing what they always wanted to do, which is engineers, less administration, less back and forth with email, where can they find Bild?
Yeah, so they can find Bild at getbild.com. That's getbild.com. And what's really great is we have a program for academics, so students and teachers that want to get onto Bild. We offer a free license to them. And then we also have hobbyist licenses and startup licenses for companies that are just getting started as well.
Okay. Is there an ideal company size you like to work with, or is it everything and anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, companies that aren't on PDM, that have been using Google Drive and Dropbox and are seeing the pains, and they aren't really extracting the value of version control, that checkout process, that are looking for a new PDM system or a data management tool that's going to drive the next level of growth of that organization, that would be perfect. We work with companies anywhere as small as like 10 designers all the way to thousands of designers as well.
Wow. Okay. All right, Pradyut, thank you for being on Engineering Tomorrow. And for all our listeners, keep engineering for tomorrow today.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks for joining us on Engineering Tomorrow. If you liked the show, please take a moment to subscribe on iTunes or Spotify. For even more great engineering or construction knowledge, visit engineeringtomorrow.blog.